Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is our Chart Your Course monthly event that we host every month from Vessel Health, currently on Zoom. So welcome everyone, and we're really happy that you're here today, and we're happiest that we have our presenter, Debney Shaw with Celefantis, and she is going to talk about something so new and kind of sounds exotic when you think about it, but it's really pretty basic stuff, which is interesting even in itself, because I think those are the things that we sometimes overlook. So again, welcome everybody. Glad you're here. And I'm going to give the floor to Danut, and then she is going to share some great things with us, and then we'll finish about 6:30. Okay. And if I didn't introduce myself, I'm Sally. I'm with Vessel Health. I do business development and marketing for our practice. And I hope I get to meet you in person one day. So thanks again. All right, Danut.
Well, thank you so much, Sally, for that introduction. As Sally said, I'm Danut Debney Shaw, and I'm with Celefantis. I'm the managing director and consultant. It's a decision strategy innovation company, and we work on thought and process development. So talking today about emotional intelligence, as I will be, it's a very strong component to that major triumvirate of emotional intelligence, which is part of subjective awareness, which is part of the intuitive process on one hand. Then in the middle, we've got the rational perspective, which is another piece of our decision-making and our decision-making innovation. And the third piece is, of course, creativity. So we're going to talk about emotional intelligence. And as Sally has suggested, emotional intelligence has become a very, very big piece today in terms of trainings that are taking place in leadership, in management, in personal development. This is now kind of the next frontier. So if you've probably heard of it before or something about it before. If you haven't, you will be hearing a lot, because emotional intelligence is being evaluated from a number of different perspectives, from the mental health perspective, from the behavioral perspective, from the day-to-day coaching perspective that some people undertake in terms of personal development and business. And it is something that is a little bit nebulous. I'm going to start us off by taking a look at this very, very important component from a defining perspective. We're going to try to define it first, because the interesting thing is, because it is such a subjective component, it's not easily defined. So let's take a look at this. First of all, what is emotional intelligence? And in fact, if I dare ask the group, I'm not going to be able to entertain a lot of questions from the group. If we have some time at the end, yes, I will be happy to engage in any questions. If we don't get to your questions, please contact me at info@Celefantis. You can see the name of the company above. Info@Celefantis. If you have questions, you want to know more about some points I've raised or some references I've made, I will be very, very happy to do that. But what I will do here and there during the course of this is just throw the question out to the audience. I love interactive events, and that's a little bit harder with Zoom because we can't go off on too many tangents. But I'd like to ask our audience here, our participating members here of the audience, what do you think emotional intelligence is? How would you define emotional intelligence? Does anybody want to tackle that? And if you don't, it's okay. I have a bunch of different definitions I'll be able to raise. But I'm just curious, from your own impression, what do you think emotional intelligence is? Anybody? Anybody brave to venture?
I think I've heard it has to do with interactions, maybe used in management towards gauging employees in some way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's part of the kinds of trainings that are being offered. Yes, that is absolutely one aspect of it. You're entirely correct. Anybody else have another thought on it? That's okay. Let me go into some of the definitions, because you see what's interesting about this whole concept of emotional intelligence. Of course, at the core of it is the idea of emotion. It wouldn't be called emotional intelligence if it didn't have a part ownership in the emotional category. But that makes it a very responsive element. It's not a static one. In other words, it's not a formula that you can learn and say, okay, from this to that, therefore the other. Because the emotional component in our lives is reactionary. We are reacting to a stimulus, we're reacting to an event, we're reacting to something we are perceiving, seeing, being introduced. So the reactions can be varied and multidimensional. Let me take a look at some of these definitions. First of all, in the Oxford language definition, they say to be aware of control and express one's emotions and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. Now that's huge. To be aware of and in control and express one's emotions and to handle interpersonal relationships judiciously and empathetically. Is that not a mouthful? Well, okay. How? That would be my question. How are we going to do that? That's a question you'll hear me asking along the way, but that's what the Oxford Language Dictionary has come up with for emotional intelligence. Now, Wikipedia says it's the capacity of individuals to recognize their emotions and those of others and discern between different feelings and label them appropriately. Use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior and adjust emotion to adapt to environments. Oh my goodness. Is that saying a lot or what? As a definition, I'll read it one more time. It is the capacity of individuals to recognize their emotions. So here we're talking about being able to identify subjectively, from a subjective awareness perspective, what it is you're actually feeling emotionally. All right, that's one component. And then it says, and then those of others. So here we're talking not just about subjective awareness, but we're talking about perceptual awareness. We're talking about being able to perceive what is coming from other people towards us, what's coming at us from others. So we have to be aware of what's happening inside of us. We have to be aware of what they are trying to bring across to us. Then it says discern between different feelings and label them appropriately. All right. And that is necessary, presumably, in order to be able to perform some kind of decision or some kind of response. You have to make some kind of decision about what you're going to do in terms of what you're perceiving inside of yourself, what your subjective awareness is telling you, and what you're getting from whoever it is you're dealing with. And then you have to be able to navigate through those feelings and label them appropriately. Then it says use emotional information to guide thinking and behavior, right? Okay, that's pretty straightforward. And adjust emotions to adapt to the environments. Now I'm going to introduce a little side thought here before I go into to some of the other components that people have come up with for this particular definition of a concept. And I'll bring up, since we talked about workplace, since you raised the idea of workplace environments and being able to, discern, to develop discernment. And you can only develop discernment through a form of practice and engagement, I would presume. And that's how discernment comes about. Now here's the interesting thing. Emotion for many, many years was thought of as something very negative in the workplace, that there is no emotion in the workplace. There should be no emotion in the workplace. And I think most people who are out here listening to me speak will nod their heads and agree that, of course, there's emotion in the workplace. There is often a great deal of emotion in the workplace. People might not be flailing around and yelling or crying or giggling their way through the day. And that kind of emotion can be certainly very intrusive in a work environment and very detrimental to the processes of a work environment and to the interactions of people in that work environment. But emotion is always there. For example, in a meeting, I personally, and I've been involved in the corporate arena for many years. If anyone is interested in my background, they can certainly take a look at it on my website, www.cilafontes.com. I'm not going to talk about it now, but I do have a variety experience in a number of different work environments. And in virtually every environment that I have been in, there's been emotion involved. Anytime there's a meeting where there is a point of view, someone is introducing a process, someone needs to bring information across, there is an investment. And wherever there is an investment, there will have to be some emotion. It isn't necessarily going to be anger. It could be apprehension. It could be a little bit of fear. It could be some anxiety. It could be any number of sort of stress triggers. Same thing with people receiving the information. So there is a virtually, it's very hard. It's almost impossible to be involved in work interactions, social interactions, domestic interactions, any kind of interactions where something is being attempted to be conveyed and unfold and happen and agree upon or negotiate. There's always going to be some emotion involved. So let's go on to Wikipedia. It says it's the capacity of individuals to recognize their emotions. Okay, that's similar. And those of others, yes. Discern between the feelings and label them appropriately. The emotional information is to guide their thinking, and it emphasizes the guiding. All right. And then we have to be able to, again, this is very similar. This is very similar to what I've just read. This is just another unfoldment, another expansion of the principles that we've discussed. Let me move forward from there. Their Wikipedia also decides to explain to us that the term first appeared, believe it or not, in 1964 and became popular with the best-selling book, Emotional Intelligence, aptly titled. And it's by a scientist who is a journalist, and his name is Daniel Goleman, Goleman. He defined emotional intelligence as the array of skills and characteristics that drive leadership performance. Again, I would ask the question, how? Because that form of definition is probably abbreviated from his book, but it also does not really explain or express how we would move forward to do that. He defines it as an array of skills and characteristics that drive leadership performance. And I'm sure he's speaking in the broader sense of leadership. Doesn't necessarily have to be your job is specifically to be a leader, but when you step forward and you must guide and you must unfold and you must bring information forward, the emotional intelligence and the skills and characteristics surrounding it are the driving force for this kind of activity. And that makes sense based on how we've understood emotional intelligence from the definitions so far. So there have been different models. There have been different models of it. There's been and you might want to take notes if you have any real interest in it. Konstantinos V. Petrides, or Petrides. Petrides, I don't know how people are pronouncing it, Petrides maybe, focused on self-reporting of behavioral dispositions and perceived abilities and processes of emotional information. Okay. They're all very heady definitions, but what do they really boil down to? And how? How are we supposed to do that? How is it supposed to happen? It's great to be able to say this mouthful of definition, of premise to different approaches to emotional intelligence, which are all very similar. They still all seem to center around what we feel emotionally ourselves, how we perceive it from the outside, and how we navigate from there. There have been neurological studies that have been developed, and characteristics and neural mechanisms of emotional intelligence have been studied a lot since the time of sort of the coining of this concept in 1964. And these studies, do they really encompass, though, the substance as well as the framework of emotional intelligence? They seem to be conclusory. Information comes as a conclusion. Okay, emotional intelligence is great for figuring out how you feel and what you want to do and how other people are engaging you, and then coming up with some kind of. Hello, I think we need to mute some folk. If you're not speaking to me, you need to mute your audio, please. Hello.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I should mute this.
Yes, that way we don't have to know all about what's going on in the family or in the background. Thank you so much. As I was saying, it's been studied neurologically, but they still haven't kind of gotten down to the grounding of it. Do these studies really encompass the substance as well as the framework of emotional intelligence? And what can we conclude from emotional intelligence being present in our lives? How do we conclude a presence in our lives from what these people are saying? What does that really do for us? So there are a lot of questions I'm bringing up, questions that you out there can ask yourselves, that I would have to ask myself, that anyone who is engaging this concept of emotional intelligence would want to look at. And, and more importantly, how does emotional intelligence actually work in our lives? It sounds good to say it's nice to be able to do it. It's nice to know what you're thinking. It's nice to know what other people are trying to convey. But what does that actually mean in our lives? I'm gonna point out some studies that were referred to here. Hold on just a moment. I'm going to roll down my outline here. And there are studies that have shown that people with high emotional intelligence excel in a variety of ways. So if we're going to talk about the kinds of studies that have been done and what the results have been of some of those studies, they tell us that greater mental health is often a result of having a stronger sense of emotional intelligence. And if we think about it, that really does make sense, that it would help to support our mental health. Of course, that takes us into a psychological track, and it's not really the goal of this discussion to go down too far with the psychological track, but more with the general behavior, the behavior and the expression of behavior that we experience within ourselves and with others. And greater mental health, though, as a byproduct, seems very logical to infer, because if we stabilize, if we come from a very centered, grounded, very emotionally understood place ourselves, then that can only help and support our psychological processes and outlook. So I believe that is what they were referring to. Job performance, something down on the ground and very specific. Job performance, here it goes back to the points that I've made about leadership, management, and assessment. This was a point that we've raised earlier, and it's very, very useful in a job context to be able to navigate what is really happening. Often people come across in a professional context in vague and sometimes challenging ways, sometimes from perspectives that seem hidden and veiled. There's a lot to divine, sometimes from coworkers, from bosses, from our subordinates in a work environment. And if we start to identify a pattern, if we start to identify behavior, for example, there's the Myers-Briggs test out there, which talks about behaviors and personality types. And it's all well and good to be able to identify a personality type according to whatever the platform is, like a Myers-Briggs. But then what are you going to do with it? How are you going to move yourself forward once you've created the identifications, once you've established the labels? How are you going to strengthen your ability to behave in accordance with it? None of these definitions and studies so far have actually really explained that or gone in that direction as far as has been conveyed to the public at large. The emotional intelligence is often associated with empathy. And that's another factor that's very important, certainly in our personal lives, with our families, with our friends, but it's definitely important in a work environment, because if we don't understand where people are coming from, I have to tell you an example here. I've worked on various contract projects that are done on an hourly basis. So you're putting in X amount of hours, you're working on certain days to complete a given project. So this is personal experience. And what I love is that sometimes those folk for whom you are working, let's say there's 5 of you or 6 of you, you've been brought in to help work on a given project based on whatever expertise you have to bring to it. And you've already mapped out a certain amount of hours, a certain amount of time that you will give to it. You're only paid by the hour. And then suddenly there's an announcement that, okay, we're going to be taking a few days of holiday. Isn't that exciting? You're going to have wonderful time off. And everybody's face drops. Because, well, wait a minute, I've already scheduled myself to be working on this project. And the whole idea is I'm only paid for the work that I'm doing. So why would I be excited by suddenly being told that we're not going to work for a number of days? That's easy for someone to say if they are a salaried individual and they're going to be paid anyway for that holiday. But if you're not being paid for the holiday, the reason I bring this example up is because it's a lack of awareness or perspective on the part of whoever's making the announcement. They're speaking from their own personal position of, yippee, I'm having a holiday for a couple of days and I won't have to work and blah, blah, blah. But for those of us in a completely different position, that's not really exciting. That's being told that time you've allotted to work and to be able to earn the money for the time that you would be putting in is now being lost. So this is a great example of how somebody just isn't taking the audience into account, isn't understanding the perspective of whoever they are announcing this to. There was another example of a group of people, I'm aware of this, at a meeting, there was an announcement that they had to work 6 days a week rather than 5. Well, okay, and why would we want to be doing this? And really there was no explanation as to what would be the benefit. You have to come up with some other offset that would get people excited about it, like they're going to be getting some other kind of compensatory time off, or they're going to be earning time towards vacation, additional time towards vacation based on the hours that they're working on a Saturday, or there will be some kind of special overtime, or you can't just tell people they're going to be working more and expect them all to be very excited about it. That's not appreciating the circumstances and the situation. So aside of these examples, let me move on to some of the criticism that has been offered about the assessment of emotional intelligence, the naming, the labeling of emotional intelligence. And some of the studies have been questioned as to whether, for example, they actually identify an intelligence. Is emotional intelligence really a specific kind of intelligence? I know that some years back, there was talk about changing the standardized IQ test. Now, I don't know how many changes may have taken place. I just remember some years ago reading about how they were going to try to incorporate different elements within the IQ test that would be suggestive, that would be suggestive of this sort of subjectivity, this kind of internal awareness, this sort of perception, this emotional intelligence. This is what they were going to try to factor in. And it was all under the heading of emotional intelligence. Because in a way, how does emotion, or how should emotion in itself, of itself, be incorporated into an IQ test? And is emotion of itself, which, we could all pretty much agree, emotion is a reaction to something. So how is emotion in itself a kind of intelligence? It might be a kind of skill, it might be a kind of tool, it might be a kind of personal tendency of reaction or response, but is it of itself a form of intelligence? So this has been raised as a concern. And whether there is an objective way to code incremental progress or process, some kind of sense of, for example, that would be utilized in IQ tests. There's a large question of how you would quantify and code that kind of subjectivity. Some believe that the emotional intelligence has a real valid relationship to IQ and personality, and others feel that it is a completely separate quality of our being, of our humanness, and not really a component of that intelligence. And also, how does it compare with, now this, for those of you who are very interested in reading psychological topics, this was part of the study that it discussed some of these aspects of criticism. And it mentioned that there's a challenge in comparing this to the big 5 personality traits that are found, I guess, in psychological premises. So I was going to say that for those of you who are very interested in sort of the psychology of this, you can pursue this question. This isn't something we're going to go deeply in here today. I just wanted to raise some of the definitions, some of the concerns surrounding those definitions, and some of the criticisms. And then we're going to go into why the emotional intelligence is so important. But just to finish out this big 5 personality trait concept, openness to experience. How does the emotional intelligence quotient deal with openness to experience? This would warrant a really big discussion and a big conceptual unpacking of aspects of emotional intelligence to even get to the idea of openness to experience. I would imagine that it's suggestive of how people engage, like they would be engaging, for example, people in the workplace or people in their family or others that they are going to be responding to. What is the openness to that experience? That, of course, has a big effect on how our personal emotions, our emotional sense is not only how it's expressed, how it's experienced for us internally, and then how it's expressed. Then it talks about of the big 5 personality traits, conscientiousness. How does it affect conscientiousness? Extroversion was another one, meaning the willingness to be able to extend yourself to someone else in empathy, in understanding, in interaction. Agreeability, that's another one of their big 5 personality traits. And neuroticism. These traits were established in the 1980s. And the neuroticism aspect, obviously, we're not going to be touching it all upon because that deals with the psychological realm. Obviously, if people are having emotional challenges, issues that are creating blockage and so forth, as I always encourage, I would suggest some form of guidance, some form of counseling, some kind of resources that would help to facilitate an understanding of what these blockages are about. And that is not within the realm of certainly the decision strategy work that I do, and it's not in the realm of our discussion today. But I brought it up because this particular study brings up these issues that are not really addressed, apparently, under this notion of emotional intelligence. How do these kinds of components of openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeability, so forth, how is that addressed within the model of emotional intelligence? So let's get on to a more practical aspect of our interest here. Why is emotional intelligence so important? Why is emotional intelligence so important? Again, I throw it out to you. Does anybody have a thought, given the way that we've looked at it, the concepts that we've raised that are embedded in these various definitions, why would you think emotional intelligence is so important? Anybody want to venture a thought? No. Nobody has any ideas about why it would be good to have a better understanding of our own emotions and those that others are expressing, because that's really what it's about. Well, let me jump into a particular group and what they have said about it. There's a group called Awakening from Alzheimer's. Some of you may have heard of this organization. I just came across and I thought, oh, how apropos to this event today. This is a group, they did an article and it's called Proven Emotional Intelligence is a Key to a Longer Life. Proven that emotional intelligence is key to a longer life. Now that's a big statement, okay? They're just jumping in and making that statement. This is, I will tell you, issue number 139, and it is the week of April 18th, 2021, if anyone wants to take a closer look at that article. In it, they point to emotional intelligence as one of the important facts of longevity. The factors, not facts, the factors of longevity. So being in touch with your own feelings and sensitive to others is something they believe is extremely important in our overall health plan. How we govern our emotions, how we deal with issues related to ourselves and others, and the sensitivity which we can address those emotions is extremely important for our own health in general. Now let's see what other points they raise. They say that emphasizing positive emotion over negative is very, very important. They say that gratitude for the good things in your life. And they point to a study. It was called the Grant Study, and it was run by George Vaillant. Vaillant. I wanted to capture some of this information for those of you who may want to look into it further. This gentleman did a study over the years with graduates from Harvard beginning in 1920. I don't know when this particular study closed, but it began in 1920, and they were studying people over the years, determining the factors that were being expressed by these individuals and how it and postulating how it might impact their potential for longevity. And the last thing that they mention is optimism and hopefulness. Optimism and hopefulness. This isn't the first time you're hearing this, I'm sure. But it's understandable that when they were going through this evaluation of how certain people are able to cope and how they're able to go through their various challenges in life emotionally, these elements of gratitude, of optimism, of positivity, of being in touch with your own emotion and those of others and being able to interact on that basis seem to be a very strong centerpiece in terms of longevity. Now, here is another interesting thing that this group from the Awakening from Alzheimer's group brought up. And I think it's very apropos of our audience here. They said that emotional intelligence can have, strengthening emotional intelligence can have a very strong impact on the aging of the heart. And I thought that was very interesting. This is obviously not a medical journal of any kind, and nor am I trying to suggest medical guidance of any sort, but I am bringing this forward because it's right there in their article. And they refer to a University of Arizona study, which was using emotional intelligence, looking at emotional intelligence to improve your own life and those of others in a synergy. And they found that this kind of awareness is linked to better function of what they call the cardiac vagal control. Do we have the doctor on the line here? Because I can't see anybody. Can we have any weigh in on that comment? Or do we not have anyone who can weigh in on that comment? Because that's a medically related point that's being made, and it's a result of this study. But it is not something that, any of us here, I think, are in a position to either agree with or disapprove. But they directly linked emotional intelligence and the strength of emotional intelligence with supporting cardiac function and the vagus nerve vagal control. And they suggest that the vagal nerve, which relates to cardiac function, may be more efficient in people who have more highly evolved emotional intelligence. Now, I'm going to suggest, although they did not really elaborate in this particular, where they captured this little snippet of the University of Arizona's research, they didn't go into great detail. And anybody who's interested in getting the link to that research, they can certainly contact me, and I will look. I have this article, and I can give them the link for it. And there may be more elaboration there, but I think it makes a great deal of intuitive sense, if you will, that the more one can work with and engage and master your emotional intelligence, your ability to assess situations, to be able to process them, to function your way in a stable manner through stressful situations, for example. I can only imagine that it would be a strong help to health overall. And not just to your heart, but your heart, of course, is my heart just jumped the other day. I ran into somebody who is a kind of very edgy, difficult individual. And I could feel it. I could feel it immediately before I had a thought, before I had a chance to evaluate, before I really identified in any deeper way who it was. I just looked at this person and I could just feel this thump of stress, actually. And then I had to bring myself into a place where there's nothing to be concerned about here. There's no issue to be had here. All of this happened in mere seconds, but this is an example. A lot of the stresses, both minor and large, that we go through in our lives have very, very strong cumulative impact on health in general, on digestion, on other features, because we are, after all, a total body. It's all one. It's all part of one. So it makes sense that they come to this conclusion. And I personally would also be very interested in seeing the details of this particular study. They said, specifically, they said that having a higher emotional intelligence may result in better control of your blood pressure, because obviously you have higher mastery of your emotion and of the response of your emotions, healthier variations in pulse rate, and fewer harmful cardiac reactions to stress. That's what came out of that study. And like I say, I would be very, very interested in seeing the validity of that study. It was raised in this article, and I thought I'd bring it forward here because there are many people I know who are on this call who would potentially be interested in having more information about a study like that. And they conclude that the more insightful you are into your own emotions and feelings of those around you, it usually goes hand in hand with the heart's more resilient and greater ability to recover from nerve-wracking and challenging situations. That's literally a slightly paraphrased, but that's pretty much a quote from it. And the article mentions other things that are useful. As we all know, there are many things that are useful in helping us to moderate emotion. They can be supplements. They can be certainly medication when necessary and when prescribed appropriately by a physician who is a specialist in the area. And also they mention meditation. Meditation now has been touted very, very heavily by many people in the medical profession, many people in the realm of psychology, many consultants, many coaches. So meditation is now one of those very mainstream tools that are utilized to help us balance our biorhythms, to help us balance our stress and our concerns and bring ourselves back into some kind of, equilibrium. And so these were the conclusions that they came up with. And how are we doing for time now? We still have a good deal of time. Okay. So having said all of this, the question is, what can we do? What can we do to strengthen our emotional intelligence in our own lives? And let me ask the audience again, does what I've brought up, the things that I've raised, the studies that I've pointed to, does all of that seem to you to support the idea that emotional intelligence is fairly important in our lives and fairly critical? Does anyone have any comment on that, or any comment on what I've brought up so far?
Yes. Just coming from
Go
me,
ahead.
Danu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just coming from me, I definitely think this plays a huge part in how, not only in how we relate to others, but how that particular knowledge that we know this can really, really, really help all those interactions, and obviously make them less stressful for not just ourselves, but for others too. So yeah, knowing that is like a great tool. I'm already thinking, what a great tool. So yeah.
Well, you raise an incredibly important point. It's like as if I had put you out in the audience so that you can bring this point up. You're talking about bringing things to awareness and consciousness. That is something that I was about to bring up when looking at this definition of emotional intelligence. I want to kind of go back to that first definition that we were talking about, because you see, when we bring things to conscious awareness and we bring them into conscious awareness repeatedly. For example, we play with it. We do it in life. Nothing in here suggests that you have to suddenly throw out a whole process in your life and do something completely differently. Hopefully, we have all been exercising a certain amount of emotional intelligence. Hopefully, we've been doing that throughout our lives to some degree. But when you bring things to conscious awareness, right, then when situations come up, you're like, oh, interesting. That awareness goes ding in there. And then you have an opportunity for some choices based on what the circumstance is. But I'm going to go back to that first definition for a reason, because if we talk about emotional intelligence and defining it, and often what has come up is that there's been a lot of difficulty in accepting any one definition or any one process that is associated, because it is subjective. It is personal. It has to work through what you've just raised, Sally, through the portal of awareness. That's how it expresses, because Emotional intelligence only comes to play as an action, as a reaction, or as a response. And that's one of my pet things, is responding rather than reacting most of the time. It's one of the things I love to talk about. But here, it's not the focus of attention. It is a component. It is a component. So what's happening is emotional intelligence, and I said it earlier on, it's not static. It is actually a response. It's highly dynamic, which is why it's different in different situations. In one given situation, probably a pause or a pullback would be very, very advantageous. In another situation, when you identify what's going on, you need to pitch in and go, yes, rah, let's do this. You need to demonstrate a different kind of dynamic. But all of that is a function of your response to what's coming at you. So here, this definition, Oxford said it, to be aware of, that's the beginning of everything. Bring it to consciousness. And when they say control, I kind of don't like the word control. I like to exercise power over, because yes, we can control ourselves and just sort of stop ourselves and grit and bear it. But it's much more effective if we are able to interact with whatever that reaction or response is within us, that we can kind of not necessarily have a whole conversation with it, but decide, is this a moment when I do need to jump in? Is this a moment when I need to step back? What would be a good way to control or moderate what is happening? And then it says to express one's emotions. Now, that's another thing. There are loads and loads of people out there, and we've run into them left, right, and center, who have a challenging time with expression. Sometimes the challenge is getting to express themselves. Sometimes it's the fact that this goes back to I did a seminar for a lot of government functionaries in the state of New Mexico at one point in time. It was a negotiation seminar, and I was asking certain questions and about capturing a certain kind of behavior in negotiation was the focus. There was very specific focus. And one person said, "Oh, for me, my way or the highway." And he really wasn't joking. Everybody else kind of looked at him like, huh? Really? Your way or the highway? That's how you like to do this? So it's very funny. He felt confident enough in himself to be able to be honest about it. A lot of people aren't honest or even very self-aware. They just naturally take their own thought process, their own perspective as being the right perspective, rather than exerting some kind of governance over that and determining, what to do with that thought process. And how to, how to be able to express that emotion and handle the interpersonal relationship, the interaction. In some cases, you are the authority. In some cases, you're the one who needs to accept the authority. But in either position, there should be an interaction between the two forces, if you will, that expresses some value in both sides. If it's just going to be a unilateral thing, or a blustery emotion, or an assault of emotion on someone, that's not exactly a win-win proposition. And it says that definition points to judiciously engaging interpersonal relationships with empathy. Now, we think of empathy often as, oh, I'm going to cry with someone because they've had a loss in their family. But no, it goes back to my own example of somebody announcing that, hey, we're going to have a bunch of days off. Aren't you happy? No, not if you've just contracted to come on board and you've set this time aside to do this work. No, you're not. But that's somebody who's just not really thinking. They're only coming from their own perspective. Empathy means being able to understand the other perspective or another side, or being willing and able to hear about that. So when we talk about how to increase I'm going to go back to the idea of how to increase emotional intelligence. Let me just pull up my thoughts on that I have here. And it's the core of emotional intelligence to begin with. And I've been talking about this already, but I'm going to put it in yet different terms. Sometimes I repeat things because they need to be heard more than once to sink in, sort of, for all of us. And also because sometimes phrasing it a different way gives it a different kind of impact. So for me, when I think of emotional intelligence, I think of it as a very strong component of subjectivity, because there's no objective emotional intelligence. That's part of the problem with trying to define it, quantify it, analyze it, try to figure out what the scale is for it, because there is so much subjectivity involved. It's what's going on inside. Sometimes it's your inner dialogue of emotion. Sometimes it's very reactionary, but it's very, very internal. And the same subjective awareness that we are talking about now is what we need to draw upon to make the best decisions that we can to take whatever action we're going to take. When people talk to me about decision making, right, they always think it's some major decision we're talking about. We're talking about the large issues, the big problems, the big questions, the big challenges. But in truth, in fact, I just saw something on YouTube. There's a gentleman who is doing some coursework that he's offering. And it's all about negotiating your way through life and how everything is a decision. Everything is a choice. Everything is a negotiation of one sort or another. And it's very, very hard to have things happening in your life and you not have some, and not have them, in other words, impact the individual in some way. It could be very small. It could be fairly indifferent. It could be a pretty balanced sort of, okay, this doesn't really rub me the wrong way or the right way. It's whatever it is. There's a good deal of that, but there are many, many things that can prey upon us in a variety of ways if we don't take the kind of control they're talking about in that definition, because we need to be able to govern, to navigate, not necessarily stifle or crush, but to govern and navigate our way through whatever is going on in our emotional lives, because we can already agree it has a rollout impact. For example, when people I've worked with who are expressing frustration about a particular direction that they're going to take strategically, and then later on we learn that what that's really about is they're very angry about a competitor, or very, why keep paying the price for that anger? That anger has an impact in terms of stifling other decisions that you can make, growth that you can make, other challenges that you can deal with because you're fixating on it, or it can also impede you in terms of your clarity, your understanding. And why should you suffer like that? Why continue to suffer in this way? Why continue to pay the price for something that you didn't do, somebody else did? Either they may have done something bad to you, or perhaps in this case, it was just a competitor who was not dealing very fairly with a given situation. It was understandable that it would be frustrating, but to allow that emotionally to fester and to affect both your own well-being and interaction with others did not seem like a great idea. So yes, this gentleman had to go off and do some personal work and then make some decisions of his own. This was beyond the scope of just plain decision making. He had to realize that there was something more fundamental that he had to do in order to be able to more constructively move forward. So perception and understanding, if we're talking about subjective awareness, which emotional intelligence is a part of subjective awareness, perception and understanding are two other elements that you have to factor into the emotional intelligence equation. And granted, I didn't exhaust all definitions. I just wanted to pick up a handful of definitions to sort of present. They were more or less similar, but they had certain differences to them, some differences in direction. But none of them brought up the fact that if you're going to do this, or how you're going to expand this emotional intelligence, they talk about the strength of emotional intelligence, which would be good for you to be able to come up with this kind of conclusion of behavior, this kind of conclusion of behavior, that kind of conclusion of behavior. But what they're not talking about is some of the foundational elements. This again speaks to how hard it is to quantify emotional intelligence. Even in trying to do trainings in a professional context, all you can do is bring up certain principles which may become involved in emotional intelligence type assessments that these people who are in leadership, or who are workers, or who are in management might need to be able to address and deal with. But there's no real how training to any of this. There's no real how explanation. Govern, or control. Okay, control. Really? How is a huge question. It's one of my pet issues. I work with the how all the time, and that's really the core of it. You can learn a platform, you can learn a theory. There are many things that you can study and incorporate, but then how are you adapting and applying that? So we looked at the definition, we looked at the components. This subjective awareness is really a critical aspect of it. How you perceive, how you understand are two elements that are very, very important factors. I was talking to somebody, and the topic was, it was a philosophical topic, and it was a very difficult philosophical topic. But the person I was speaking to had a very strong emotional slant on it. And therefore, all of the perception that he was applying, all of his understanding was based on the foundations of that emotion. He felt very, very strongly about this particular aspect in an emotional way. And even though he thought he was being rational about it, he actually really wasn't. He was just trying to find arguments that would support his emotion. And so how we perceive something, how we understand it, how we feel it, what it means to us, makes a huge difference in how we can strengthen our emotional intelligence equation, how our quotient of it, because that's something we need to become aware of. So it goes back to what you raised, Sally. The perception, the consciousness. It's not something you have to now sit down and go, oh my goodness, more pressure. I'm going to have to figure out how I'm dealing with things emotionally. No, it becomes part of how we function in life. It's part of our becoming really good friends with who we are inside ourselves. At the core of our understanding of our emotional intelligence lies the distinction also between thinking and feeling. See, these are all points that I'm bringing up about how to strengthen emotional intelligence. Again, through awareness and then by engagement, right? A lot of people don't really know the difference between thinking and feeling. That's one to throw out for everybody. I often have conversations with people and they'll say, I think it's blah, 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 blah. Well, like the gentleman I was just referring to, he wasn't actually thinking, he was feeling with tremendous passion. And that's why he found it perfectly reasonable to reverse himself in a number of ways, as long as it was consistent with the way he was actually feeling. So he was expressing feeling and not really any kind of rational thought process. Sure, a feeling, if you're going to express a feeling, it will, it can be a thought form. We don't even have the appropriate language yet to come up with the distinctions. That will probably come as they continue to study emotional intelligence and subjectivity. We're going to have some expansion of language to be able to be more granular in how we discuss and how we kind of pull apart our understanding. But he was really just being emotional and frankly kind of babbling. Okay, I'm not saying that to be mean to him or anything. I understood the passion. I understood the passion of his feeling, but it definitely wasn't a question of thinking, of this kind of logical, cognitive, rational, from this to that, therefore this, kind of a logical train of thought. No, and it's helpful for us to understand when we are really being over engaged by our feeling about something, or whether we're being really quite clinical and thinking about it. Sometimes people will say to me, I feel it's blah, blah, blah. No, they're not feeling. They're expressing a wonderful logical premise, and they're developing it with some, secondary and tertiary premises. And then they're coming to some logical conclusions. That's not feeling. That's actually very logical thinking. And sometimes we don't become aware of those distinctions, but it's not a bad practice to sometimes pause when you feel yourself behaving very strongly in a direction or reacting very strongly in a direction. It may be time to kind of pull back subjectively and take a look at that. Is it just that I'm being passionate because, my sister was in this kind of incident, and I think everybody who causes this kind of incident should be summarily locked away? You can tell that there's a great deal of passion behind that kind of thinking. Now, whether that becomes a logical solution or not is a whole different story. But that comes from some passion and pain and resentment and other things like that. So discernment is really very, very important in this whole process of trying to figure out our emotional intelligence. Now, here's another one I'm going to throw out there for strengthening emotional intelligence. Is every feeling an emotion? Does anyone have any comment on that? Are feelings and emotions exactly the same? In other words, do they mean the exact same things, would you say? Or if not, why not? Does anybody have a thought on that? The idea of feelings versus emotions? Like how you think of those two terms in your own mind? I guess not, huh? Well,
Well,
I guess what
I
I was,
do.
okay,
I
okay,
just-
go for it.
well,
Go, please. I'm inviting
mean-
the engagement. Go ahead.
Okay, so, and we are getting close, so I just wanted to give you that so we can make sure we have a
Okay.
clean
We'll
end
be done.
and time to,
We'll
yeah.
be done shortly. I have very few points to mention. I'm just going to mention a couple of points here.
Okay,
But
so
go
I'll
ahead.
keep
Yeah.
this brief. I just think that, but kind of like going back to what you said about a feeling being, you know, being a thought. It is buried. It's very buried and it's layered in there. And if it does, you know, it's triggers.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's triggers. So if it's something, obviously we all can relate, you know, if it was something
Yeah.
maybe, you know, from our childhood or from our young adulthood or whatever it is that we kind of have this,
Yeah.
this,
Experiences.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, and these experiences give us staunch beliefs or feelings about certain things, certain people, sometimes certain situations,
Mhm.
or whatever, like, you know, whether it be hurt or
Yes.
embarrassment or, you know, whatever,
Yes.
wronged.
Yes.
So yeah, that makes
Yes.
it is hard. You have to kind of get to that place where, yeah, you know, you have to think about what's the healthy way for me to actually to just recognize it, but not necessarily, I mean, and share it possibly, but yet I don't need to push this thought or belief or
Right.
anything on anyone else, right? So yeah,
Right.
that's kind of,
Right.
yeah.
And that's wonderful. Yes, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And also here's another point. I'm just going to throw out briefly. We don't have the time. There's a lot of things we could continue to pick apart. We don't have the time for that. But here's the other thing. And again, this has to do with our language and our ability to understand how to look at certain separate issues. For example, perception is often talked about as a feeling. And it's not really an emotion. It's like I perceive something, or I have a gut instinct, or I have a feeling about. That's not quite the same thing as emotion. And again, this isn't the forum to really, focus on that. But I wanted to raise that distinction as another element to take into consideration. So let me tie things up a little bit here. So high emotional intelligence presupposes a high degree of this kind of internal awareness and understanding. What we've been talking about, the points that have been raised, your comments, Sally, all of that factors into a higher degree of that awareness and understanding, grappling with these things. Critical thinking, for example, which is in the realm usually of the rational, requires an understanding of basic elements and information among which there can be an internal debate, but it has a rational kind of progression. But most of the satisfying and successful decisions in our lives, which involve the strongest and most positive responses, come from an integration of that ability to see something in a kind of evolved and linear fashion, but also to be able to understand it perceptually and emotionally and empathetically. And that all of that ends up factoring into our the degree and level of our emotional intelligence. And with high emotional intelligence, there's an important factor in the way all of these pieces come together and the way that we are able to bring the pieces together that I've just mentioned: the subjective awareness, the emotional intelligence, the intuition, the creativity, the clear, rational thinking. All of that ultimately has to go into a mix. And all the most successful people in their personal lives, in their professional lives, are people who find a way to get comfortable and at home with that. But it all begins with initial awareness. So it comes back to what you said, Sally. It all begins with initial awareness. So those are some of the points I wanted to bring up to help strengthen emotional intelligence and to assist us and facilitate our ability to navigate our challenges and our decision-making as we go through life. And that is my presentation.
I have
Sally,
a question.
are you there? Oh,
I-
yeah, you have a question. Okay, very
Yeah.
good.
What was the, you made a point about meditation being mentioned in a
Yes.
study. Were they
Yes.
saying that meditation is something a person can use to increase or strengthen?
Emotional intelligence,
yeah.
yes. And I believe, and I'm of course, I'm just kind of grossly summarizing here, but I believe the whole point of that was because the meditation is a tool which helps us to create a kind of equilibration within ourselves. It kind of brings us into, first of all, a relaxed state. There's been a lot of discussion and study on what it does for biorhythms, what it does for the, elevation of certain different, hormones and things in our body. But the bottom line is it helps us to settle into a greater clarity. That was really what they were coming up with. The idea that it can clear the ground for us, because we let go of a lot of the ancillary, busy talk within our brains, the kind of confusion that we sometimes set ourselves, up with because of this and that, and this thought and that thought, and the other thing that comes in. If you can settle, if you can clear, if you can get to that place of that kind of equilibrium, and then engage the world, which is why now there's been such a strong push towards incorporating meditation in our lives, regardless of what spiritual or philosophical stance we have, because it's just a marvelous, marvelous tool for getting the noise out of the system, bringing us to a center, and to be able to kind of bring that into our lives. I know many people who meditate very regularly, and they find that it gives them greater energy, greater clarity, but it relaxes them. And so when they engage their emotions, when they engage these situations, they are then able to work their way through all of that with greater ease. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank everybody. Thank you for the questions and definitely the answers. And we're all going to have a lot of those, I'm sure. Danute, thank you again for such insightful information. And it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg,
Yes.
It's just the nature of it. But Sheila Fontes, as you can all see from the video here, we can definitely reach out individually, however you would like, because like Danute had invited everyone in the beginning to go ahead and get with her if that was something you wanted to do afterwards. So each and every one of you, if you wanted to take that information down, there it is. And if you want to reach it back out to me, I'm in the office tomorrow, and I'm happy to answer any questions or connect you with Danute again. So thank you all for being here and supporting us at Vessel Health. And I wanted you to know we will have Danute back. So again, thank you for being so gracious and doing such a great job. And our next Chart Your Course will be on Zoom in May. It's going to be a little bit tweaked. We usually have it the third Wednesday evening, but it will be the second Wednesday evening. So it'll be May 12th, and it will be with Hallie Bourne. She's a spiritual coach, and her subject, you'll be watching for the flyer, but her subject is going to be meditation, the gift of sourcing within. So I'll look forward to that as well. Thank you, everybody. Wonderful to have you all. Have a wonderful evening. And Danute, thanks again.
Oh, the last thing
Thank
I
you.
wanted to mention is if anybody is interested in my book, How the Tin Man Found His Brain, you can go ahead and contact me as well. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me. It was great being here.
title.
Thank you.
Thank you for the
That's a great
enjoyable
title.
presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you. Bye-bye.
everybody. And I
Thank
can't
you.
wait till we can all meet in person. Have a nice evening, all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.